Good evening and welcome to the Job Search Solution, the radio program where we talk about looking for a job, changing jobs, changing careers, hiring. And as always, we begin with a prayer. Dear God, grant us thy peace and thy mercy, thy will be done. In this session, we're going to begin talking about stories and why stories are so important in your job search if you were a candidate. Doesn't hurt to have good stories when you're a hiring authority either, but we're going to talk about stories. We're going to talk about the philosophy of stories and what stories do for you and your interviewing in this session. And then next week, we're going to talk about specific types of stories that you would use in the interviewing process. There are 6 types of stories. Who am I stories, why I am here stories, vision stories, teaching stories, value stories, and I know what you're thinking stories. All of these kinds of stories should enter into your interviewing process. These stories should never be more than 45 seconds to maybe a minute and a half, but not much longer than that. And the reason they're important, we learned from a number of different places. Philosophers tell us that stories are more than entertainment. They teach us the art of being human. There are 2 things that never get boring, G.K. Chesterton said, a person and a story. And the story needs to be about people. So when you are telling stories, you are communicating your human side, especially in the interviewing process, as well as explaining what you've done in the past and how you are therefore going to be successful for the company that you're interviewing with. Psychologists tell us that stories are successful because they remove the prejudice of the listener towards the storyteller and encourage the listener to identify with the person in the story. People remember stories because they identify with the people in the stories. And by doing that, the listener becomes more engaged in this storyteller and ask themselves the questions like, what would I have done in that situation? As listeners, we get so caught up in the drama of the story, we have little emotional energy to disagree or agree with the storyteller themselves. That's why Jesus Christ taught in parables and stories. Every good teacher, the Buddha, Aesop, and any teacher taught in stories. And what's even more interesting and more relevant to stories regarding your job search comes from a Princeton neurologist by the name of Uri Hasson. He recently discovered that the listeners of a story develop exactly the same brain patterns as the storyteller. The storyteller literally makes the listener's brain patterns match their own. So if you want people to see the world the way you do, tell them a compelling story and get their brain patterns to match yours. Storytelling breeds a connection between the tellers and the listeners. The shared flourish of a joy at the climax of a story, or the mutual gloom of a sad situation or something tragic, gets the listener to understand and communicate the same feelings. Now, does that interpersonal link also take a visual, measurable form? It does. A team of researchers videoed students as they recounted emotional experiences from falling in love to death of a friend. And as they spoke, an eye tracking device measured the dilation of the pupils of their eyes, which research indicates expanded and contracted with the ups and downs of the mental engagement and the story. Later, more than 100 students watched the videos as they were also monitored with eye trackers. And during the parts of the story that rated especially engaging, the researchers found that the dilation of the listener's pupils more closely matched the dilation of the speaker's pupils. Synchrony was greatest between participants who rated high on a measure of empathy and speakers high on the expressiveness results that were held even when the listeners didn't see the speakers. The findings were indicative of what's called mental coupling. And this mental coupling, according to Dartmouth neuroscientist Theala Wheatley, makes the story even more important. Without people listening, speaking is just disturbing the air molecules, she says. Communications requires coupling of minds. And then finally, from the king in Alice in Wonderland, we learn how to tell a story when he instructed the White Rabbit to begin at the very beginning and go all the way to the end. Make sure you complete the story. Don't go away. This is Tony Bashara with the Job Search Solution.